The Foreseen arcade. Active.
When I did the video on Station magazine, I mentioned it lasted 10 issues during its entire run. What I didn't expect, however, was the discovery of another UK magazine that had a much shorter run than Station. And that magazine was LCD Publishing's New Station. This particular magazine only ran for 5 issues, from September 1999 to December of the same year. And within its short run, I was able to find 6 games that qualify for this video. Not that I have anything better to do, let's consider this to be a sequel to the Station magazine episode. So, let's get started with it and see what they consider to be particularly rubbish PS1 games. We begin this episode with a racing game, NASCAR 2000, which new PlayStation misspelled the name as NASCAR 2000. What a way to start things off, guys. Real classy. Reviewed on issue 4, Cliff Smith's first strike against this game was that the graphics engine is nothing special, especially compared to games like Ridge Racer Type 4 or F1 99. The cars suffer visible damage and there are simulated shadows, but that's about it for the clever stuff. The next point in his review was the fact that despite NASCAR 2000 using the analog option for steering, it's very slow and jerky, making the cars difficult to control. While the game does have 25 accurately modeled tracks, 18 of them from the official NASCAR circuit, but most of them are simple ovals with banked corners. These may allow cars to go really fast, but at the same time they virtually eliminate any opportunity for skillful driving. And since the cars are built to very strict rules governing size, shape, and performance, all models in the game look exactly the same. And since the majority of the gameplay consists of holding the X button and occasionally moving your left analog stick about 2mm, the inclusion of performance and handling options were made practically pointless. Even on 7 non-oval tracks, the lack of driver AI from the other cars means that you can just barge your way through the front of a queue and stay there until the finish. He wrapped up his review stating that NASCAR 2000 isn't fun. Partially because of the disappointing graphics, partly because the cars look, well, rubbish, and mostly because NASCAR racing is a very boring sport in general, suggesting that if you want excitement and fun in a driving game, you should just get Driver or even Toka 2 instead. The game wound up with a 40% rating, putting it in the average area in the new meter, with the verdict frustratingly asking why EA kept churning these NASCAR games year after year. On the bright side, I was able to actually complete a NASCAR race in first while doing the footage for this game. You know, if I had €1 for every PlayStation magazine video where a poorly received game gets a more positive re-review later on, I'd have €2. I suppose it's enough for me to buy a pack of Haribo Tankfastics at Aldi, but the fact that this happened twice in a row was pretty surprising. It happened with Bloodlines on my Station magazine episode from earlier, so the exact same thing occurred with the preview build of Le Mans 24 Hours, when it was reviewed by Paul Bartlett on issue 3. He began his review by saying that the Le Mans license is a fairly good one. More specifically, it's not based on a movie starring Steve McQueen, but the actual race itself. The cars are entirely modern, and it's pretty much bog standard racing fare. Looking at what the game has on offer, you can indeed play the game for 24 hours if you feel like it. And it's a good thing you can save at certain points, because, let's be honest, nobody will be crazy enough to simply drive for 24 hours straight. And of course, we have arcade, championship, and multiplayer modes. However, upon playing it, Paul learned that Le Mans 24 Hours was nothing more than an average game, with shocking graphics and slow, chugging gameplay being its major flaws. And when compared to games like Gran Turismo and Wipeout 3, it seems even worse than it actually is. But what was really galling for him is that the new PlayStation crew had high expectations for it. With such a prestigious license like that, they expected it to be a great game. Terrific graphics, a great feeling of speed, realistic modeling, you get the idea. And then they played it, with Paul saying the graphics aren't even as good as the original Ridge Racer, and the speed felt like standing behind a car and pushing. He concluded that despite the nice touches, Le Mans 24 Hours is one of the worst racers on PlayStation, calling it a totally wasted license. The game originally got a score of 45%, with the verdict saying that Le Mans 24 Hours is so dull, it should be renamed Le Mans 24 Minutes, which is how long it'll take you to take it back to the shop. If there's one thing I know about racing games, it's that you either love them or hate them. And one of the major problems that all magazines have in giving games to reviewers is to how to balance the personal preferences of the reviewer, and that is still true, most of the time, with gaming websites like Push Square. In fact, sometime after the issue was on sale, Infogrames contacted the new PlayStation staff at LCD Publishing that their review was based on an unfinished preview version. So it was only fair that the game got re-review for issue 4, with Cliff Smith giving it 80%, bumping it from average to being close to excellent. Though he did mention that due to the console's hardware limitations, the PlayStation version is somewhat slower and jerkier compared to the PC version. No game is perfect, but hey, it was a far better review than the one it got earlier. We have 2 more games from issue 3 that qualify for this video, and our next game is PGA European Tour Golf, another game from Infogrames. Russ Ware started his review by stating the fact that golf has always been a game of gentlemen, played with business associates and the like. It was always considered a rich man's sport. But not anymore. Golf has almost come to the masses, and the demand for good golf games has never been higher, especially in 1999, with Sony and Claphan's Everybody's Golf being the best choice for PlayStation owners looking to scratch that itch. While what PGA European Tour Golf had to offer was not too bad, the option of playing some fun games like block golf, night golf, hazard golf, and island golf were not that much fun. The European Tour is where the big money is, after all. But once he began his European tour, the first bogey he encountered was the pixelation of surroundings of players, looking like this was trying to emulate a Game Boy Color title. Things don't get much better when you line up your shot, as everything from the giant direction arrow movement to the actual swing is poorly animated and shockingly unrealistic. In fact, the only thing he praised this game for is the commentary from Peter Ailes, which is intelligent and useful in places. But it wasn't enough to save this game in his eyes, as the last bit of advice he could offer to readers is to call their caddy over, pick out a nice 3-wood, and drive this game into the nearest water hazard. New PlayStation potted PGA European Tour Golf into the poor category with a score of 35%, with the verdict calling it a shockingly bad game that deserves to be banned from the club and have its membership taken away, while Aaron said that PGA 3 on the Mega Drive was a much more superior game compared to this outing. The third and last game from issue 3 is South Park, with Aaron Taylor being assigned to the review. For his introduction, Aaron wrote that he absolutely adores The Simpsons, who calls it an amazing feat and a testament to the skills of the numerous brilliant writers and a creative team. The series had been running for over 10 years by that point, and even today, it is showing no signs of stopping. South Park, on the other hand, was a different matter. With ratings falling and consumer interest dropping at the time, you'd have to wonder how long Matt and Trey can keep up the joke. While he personally enjoys the rude and crude antics of Kyle, Stan, Cartman, and Kenny, but having swamped in shoddy merchandise and poor cash-ins, the South Park boys were starting to get on his nerves. And that's how he felt when he reviewed South Park for the PlayStation. Right off the bat, the game is essentially Appaloosa Software's dumbed-down port of the Nintendo 64 game by Iguana Entertainment, the same team behind the Turok series, which explains why it uses the same engine. With a myriad of issues that wouldn't be enough to fit within a single page, Aaron called this sport a cheap and wholly desperate attempt by Acclaim and Comedy Central to milk fans just one more time before the South Park bubble will finally burst. Which, ironically, it did, as the show is still going as of today. New PlayStation gave the sport a score of 28%, with the verdict saying that it's shoddy in the extreme, calling it the kind of dribble that should have never been allowed to hit the store shelves, while Lee couldn't agree with his esteemed colleague more, as it was such a massive cop-out of what should have been a cool game. Just stick with a Nintendo 64 version instead, folks. Next on this video, we have Psychic Force 2, reviewed by Cliff Smith as part of the magazine's 5th and final issue. This is also the only import review we have on this video. What we have here is a port of Psychic Force 2012, the full arcade version of which being released on the Sega Dreamcast, with the PlayStation release getting a bonus in the form of 3 extra characters added from the original Psychic Force. Unfortunately for Cliff, Psychic Force 2 is totally packed. There are 10 characters to start with, but there isn't much to choose between them since they all fight the same way. The game consists of moving a character up, down, or sideways in a big box and blasting bolts of energy at your opponent until they're defeated. According to Cliff, the standard of animation will embarrass a Popeye cartoon, and despite each character having their own attacks and throws, the range of moves is restricted to blast stuff or shield up. The opponent AI was criticized for having hit with a stupid stick more times than it is strictly sensible, as all they could do is move randomly and put their shields up occasionally. As a result, every opponent will be beaten pretty easily, even on the hardest difficulty. Of course, the import games market is a strange one, since there are people out there, myself included, who will pay over the odds for a potentially substandard game, knowing full well that they aren't going to understand any of the text or speech, let alone actually getting it to run on their PAL PlayStation consoles, and still be pleased with themselves when they've done so. For new PlayStation, Psychic Force 2 is a dull and repetitive beat-em-up with shoddy animation, boring characters, and severely limited gameplay. If it had come along about 3 or 4 years ago, it could probably have held on its own, but when you get the likes of Shaolin for a lot less money, and you've got the unbeatable Tekken 3, then why bother? Psychic Force 2 ended up with a score of 26%, with the verdict calling it dull and unrewarding, with outdated graphics and minimal gameplay, while Aaron said that it's even worse than Yusha, thanks to awful controls, dodgy graphics, and chronically bad gameplay. And finally, we go to the magazine's first issue and look at the review for our final game on this video, in the form of the X-Files game. Paul Bartlett, who wrote the review, mentioned that the potential for the X-Files game was always great. Of course, the basic format had to be of an adventure game if it was ever going to succeed, and naturally, this is a course that developers at Hyperbole Studios took. Unfortunately, they chose to discard the well-trodden but reliable format we saw with Secret of Monkey Island or Blade Runner, in favor of the deeply unpopular interactive movie. He continued by stating the fact that all interactive movies are awful, as people have tried and failed to make FMV-based computer games since the early 90s. Each of these games have been touted as different, quote-unquote, and truly playable, but in reality, each has been a travesty and most sank without a trace. The X-Files game, as poor as it was, didn't do badly financially, being a big license and all, but if he was a cynic, he might have even thought Fox Interactive just wanted the game in the shops knowing it'll sell no matter how poor it was. To be fair, things weren't looking too bad, as the quality of the full motion video is actually very good indeed, as they are all crystal clear and the sound is more or less perfect. Unfortunately, the wooden and cliche-ridden acting used to fill the 4 CDs the game came with is awful, as he wrote, as even established characters such as Director Assistant Skinner struggled to make most of her awful material and ended up failing miserably, looking as though he's truly embarrassed to be involved. The game itself basically plays similarly to Myst, but besides the acting that left a lot to be desired, Paul also criticized the very poor characterization, its painfully linear nature, so little action and excitement that it could well bore you to tears, and worst of all, it's probably impossible to complete unless you're very patient or very lucky. Chris Carter supposedly wrote this game's story himself, so the question Paul asked here is why it is so excruciatingly bad. Maybe he didn't write the script, or maybe he was having an off day, like he was when he wrote Millennium. Either way, Paul wrote that in conclusion, the X-Files game is abysmal, as even the world's biggest fan of a show wouldn't find any redeeming features. While some scenes in the game can be unintentionally funny, he certainly won't be laughing if he just paid the asking price of £40 to play this game. The FMV sequences are the only good point of what is otherwise a disastrous release, at least in his words. And so, the game ended up being the worst rated game in the magazine's 5-issue run, ending up with a score of 24%, with the verdict saying that like a horrible sore-covered human/alien crossbreed, the X-Files game is best avoided, while Richard says it does nothing to convince gamers that FMV games are any good, describing it as definitely a missed opportunity. You know what? Despite the magazine's brief run, there was still a lot to dig in than I was anticipating. Of all the 6 games we saw on this episode, do you agree with any of New PlayStation's reviews? Or do you beg to differ regarding one of the games or two? Feel free to share in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching and I'll see you next time on the Foreseen Arcade.